Welcome to a new episode of the NEXUS podcast series. NEXUS is an EU-funded project that strives to make inclusivity a reality in the world of research and innovation. The project focuses on developing inclusive gender equality plans that span both in intersectional and intersectoral dimensions in 9 universities and research organizations across Europe. For more information about Nexus, please visit our project website at nexusproject.info. In this episode of the podcast series, we explore institutional change processes towards intersectionality in higher education. And for this, we are honored to have Dr. Grace Idahosa with us today. Grace is Assistant Professor in Education and Social Justice at Cambridge University. She's a doctor in political and international studies from Rhodes University in South Africa. Her research encompasses two complementary lines of inquiry. On the one hand, agency and higher education transformation, and on the other, feminist and decolonial thought. Today, Grace will be interviewed by Anita Metza, researcher and project manager at Nexus partner Smart Venice. Thank you very much, Grace and Anita, for joining us today. And over to you, Anita.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for joining us. Grace, to begin, would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself and your work to our listeners?
Thank you, Anita and Sarah, for the invitation to join you today. I look forward to an engaging conversation with you. So, as Sarah noted, I am an assistant professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge. Prior to that, I was at the University of York for about a year, and then prior to that, I was in South Africa for about 8 to 10 years, which is where I completed my master's doctorate and did a bit of postdoctoral work there. In terms of my research, so my primary interest has been on individual stories, individual experiences of inequality, individual experiences of inclusion or not being included, and its impact on their agency, its impact on their ability to participate, whether as students or as staff members or faculty members within higher education institutions. And I explore the question of agency and transformation via different stakeholders, but also via different lenses. So some of my work, for instance, focuses on doctoral students' experiences or first generation students' experiences of being in the university and some of the challenges that affects the experiences of Black women, particularly in STEM fields. Part of that research also explores the experiences of first generation academic staff members and also the experiences of individuals who take action to engender change or transformation within their institution. And this is where my work on agency comes in, as I explore how individuals navigate the enabling and constraining conditions within universities. And I understand these enabling and constraining conditions as operating not just within the university, but also outside the university. I look at the strategies that they employ in order to promote change. Finally, part of that work also explores questions of decolonization and reflexivity and what that means for agency and transformation within higher education context. The final note is that primarily my work has focused on the South African context, but in the last 5 years, I have expanded my work to look at the Indian context and also the Northern Ireland context, which is the focus of my current project. and that explores agency and transformation within post-conflict context, a comparative study of South Africa and Northern Ireland.
Great, thank you. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about some of the details of your work. As we heard from Sara, one of the goals of the NEXUS project is to support institutional change processes in intersectional directions. And a sentence from the bio on your website that caught my attention states that if universities are to contribute to societal development, they will first have to transform themselves. And I thought we could begin by exploring what you mean by this and why it's so important, with reference to how higher education institutions perpetuate inequalities. And as you mentioned, you have conducted research on participation, career progression, and retention of Black women in STEM disciplines, particularly in South Africa. Could you tell us a bit about how interlocking systems of oppression influence the experiences of Black women in STEM, for instance, in the South African context?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Anita. So the way I see it, the question is two parts. One, really looking at the primary role and function of the university and the possibilities of its contributing to societal development and societal change. And the second, really looking at how individuals within these spaces experience different forms of oppression. Am I correct? I'll say that the idea or the argument that if universities are to contribute to societal development, they will first have to transform themselves is not new, but it emerges from the idea of the perceived role and function of the university as a public good, which alludes to the point that universities have a role to play or make a contribution to social development, as they are tasked with the responsibility of training the next generation. If we agree that universities have this public social responsibilities, and that they often mirror societal inequalities, then it stands to reason that in order for them to make any contribution to change, that they will have to first transform themselves. And this is where my work really starts from, exploring the possibilities for change within higher education institutions. Related to that, one strand of my work kind of explores how Black South African women, as one dimension of stakeholders within higher education institutions, how they navigate intersectional, intersecting systems of oppression within the higher education context in South Africa. Before I go into talking about that, I should note that my work on agency primarily starts with the premise that people are not necessarily limited by institutional cultures, institutional structures, that there are all conditions for enablement, and there are also conditions for limitations, or that place limitations on the ability of individuals for individuals to enact transformation, or to act, or to feel like they belong within a space. Now, as it relates to South African women in STEM disciplines, this study was born out of my work that looks at the experiences of first-generation students. And my collaborator and I thought that it might be useful to explore the experiences of Black, often first-generation students, particularly in STEM, knowing fully well that in the South African context, and I'm sure this would apply outside the South African context, there is some level of gender inequality or disparity in the inclusion, the progression and success of women generally in STEM, but particularly the numbers seem to dwindle when you divide across gender and race, so particularly for Black women. And we wanted to explore how Black women, particularly in doctoral programs in STEM disciplines, kind of experience the system and how they navigate that system and how they're able to succeed, or the factors that do not enable them succeed. And in this study, one of the things that we explored was how structural constraints and conditions, cultural conditions, and interpersonal conditions affect individual experiences or affects the experiences of Black women. At the cultural level, we examined the ways in which institutional cultures, assumptions about specific races, specific genders, might affect or impact the success and progression. So, for example, one of the things that we discovered or uncovered was how assumptions from both lecturers and their male colleagues about the role of women in society, particularly coming from a cultural context where the tradition is highly masculinized and patriarchal. How the assumptions, also patriarchal and masculine assumptions, framed the engagement of lecturers with their Black female students, framed the engagement of the Black male peers with, and sometimes Black female peers, how that colored or influenced their experience. So I'll give an example, an instance of a student that talked about being asked, why are you here? You have a pretty face, so you don't need to study. So here we see an intersection of cultural assumptions. We see an intersection of gendered assumptions and affecting or creating a condition where that in this instance, that individual did not feel like they belong. That study revealed several of these assumptions and the predispositions that affect participants' experiences of belonging and affect their experiences or ability to navigate the space. What was particularly interesting for me in this project is how individuals responded. There were variations of response where while some individuals decided to drop out and not continue their study, primarily because of comments such as those or harassment or feeling like they do not belong. Others took it as a challenge to prove people wrong. But then the other side of it are questions on the consequences of taking on that emotional burden to prove people wrong, working 10 times harder, which kind of can lead to burnout, and in this case, in some participants. For those who chose to continue, at the end of the doctoral degrees, they got to the point where they decided they were not going to continue in academia. And maybe perhaps this links to the structural issues that I was talking about earlier, and the ways in which neoliberal ideas and neoliberal ideologies are kind of infused with colonial ideas to determine who belongs and who doesn't belong, where historically science and the scientific discipline has been positioned as a masculine space. By nature, it means that that anyone who enters into that space and does not embody these masculine characteristics or masculine trait is constructed as out of place. And that construction and out of place furthers the experiences of unbelonging or feelings of unbelonging, and limits the agency and the possibilities to navigate, or the ability to navigate and be successful within those contexts. So in terms of the interlocking systems, I see like interlocking systems at a structural level. We see interlocking systems at the cultural level, And we also see interlocking systems at the individual level, interlocking both within the structures, but even across structures and cultures, to create conditions that might that affects career progression, affects participation, affects success within these spaces. Before I end, I should note that even though these conditions appear limiting, the fact that the participants in this study were able to continue highlights their agency, highlights their ability to be resilient. Although I've recently begun to question the discourse of resilience and how that kind of puts excessive pressure on marginalized identities. So the idea is that if we can tell this person to be resilient, then they should be able to weather any conditions. And for me, the question is, do their white female or white male counterparts have to adapt such resilience to be able to succeed? So resilience becomes a problematic discourse in that case because of what it's asking certain identities, people with certain identities and positionality to do, to accept in order to succeed within any institutional culture or institutional context.
Thank you. I'm very interested in the theme of belonging that you mentioned, as it seems to be a very interesting lens to analyze the experiences of different marginalized identities within universities. And also what you just mentioned now about resilience putting pressure on marginalized identities is also a very interesting aspect. Additionally, it's also particularly relevant, as you mentioned, in the STEM fields. And I think most of the NEXUS partners can be characterized by a strong STEM orientation, which, as you mentioned, has implications for inequalities, both in terms of horizontal segregation and vertical segregation. I want to turn to the theme of sustainability and sustainable change, which I know you have touched upon in your research. So the NEXUS project lasts 2 years, which is a relatively short time for implementing institutional change. And as a result, a crucial component of the project's logic has been to include reflection on ways to promote sustainabilities of the actions implemented towards gender equality and intersectionality. So I'm curious to hear from you about possible strategies emerging from your research for promoting the sustainability of institutional change, and how we can make actions that promote an intersectional approach sustainable and long-lasting. Sometimes there is a push to achieve this by integrating gender equality policies and gender equality bodies into the broader diversity, equality, and inclusion framework. And I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on this approach.
Thank you very much for that. Perhaps I'll start with your last question and work backwards from there. I think I don't have a particular response to that, more of like a thought process. But it seems to me that if the argument, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to, so I think on one end are those who are arguing to promote gender inequality or equality as part of a broader EDI framework, and those arguing to separate it. And my question has always been because of the intersectional nature of privilege and oppression, then it doesn't, it seems to me that the incorporation in broader initiatives related to EDI seems to be the best approach. because then we are not just zeroing in on the gender dimension of individuals' experiences of either privilege or oppression. An individual can experience oppression due to the gender, due to the race, due to the class, due to their sexuality. And the confluence of these factors creates kind of unique forms of oppression and unique forms of experiences. So it seems to me that any approach or any attempt to separate or isolate risks ignoring or privileging one form of oppression over the other. And might not necessarily meet the needs of individuals within that institutional space or institutional context. So, for instance, if a Black female student is experiencing different forms of oppression owing to her being Black, being female, and being middle class or working class, and we kind of only focus on ameliorating the gender inequality, that doesn't provide the necessary conditions for the individual to enact the agency. It doesn't provide the necessary conditions for them to feel like they belong. Because even if they feel like they belong as women within this space, they do not feel they will not be able to feel like they belong as Black people within the space. So primarily because we experience, and it's very difficult to separate and isolate them and say, okay, I'm experiencing this because I'm a woman, I'm experiencing this because I'm Black, I'm experiencing this because I'm young. It's very difficult to kind of separate them because they're always intersecting, they're always working together. It doesn't seem to me that separating gender equality would be an ideal solution to any kind of sustainable change or transformation within institutions. I want to add also that, particularly as it relates to creating sustainable change or sustainable transformation within institutions, two things have emerged. First is that a recognition that change takes time. So it's not something that is seen or visible. So if you look at the work of Margaret Archer and the morphogenetic approach, it talks about T1 to T4, kind of indicating that change happens over time. So I bring up the question of time because there is a kind of urgency, a sense of urgency when we push and fight for change. But I think in terms of creating sustainable change, there needs to be a recognition that the change itself, the change process itself takes time. Related to that, or the second thing I wanted to talk about is how institutions respond to the push for change, how they respond to the demand for equality. And institutions, by their very nature, are fixed. They set in their ways and will often resist any kind of desire to change or argument for change or push for change. And from my work, it's emerged that sometimes where institutions don't want to change or where they want to resist change, they engage in box-ticking exercises that just creates initiatives, inclusion initiatives, whether it relates to gender, race, or class, or sexuality, that do not really address or meet the needs of the experiences of those within that context and that system. And that if we are to attain any kind of change or sustainable change, there needs to be a real commitment on the part of institutions and individuals within those institutions to actually enabling change within those spaces. What that often means is that some people will have to endure discomfort in the interim in order to meet these goals, and that discomfort is and the process of change is a messy process. It's not something that is linear. It's not something that's going to be easy. But unless that commitment is made, then we're not going to attain sustainable change. We're going to be having similar conversations 50, 100 years from now.
I'm interested in hearing about one of your lines of research, which is the one on decolonial thought and decolonizing higher education, particularly the role of teaching practices and reflexivity in a decolonial approach. If you could tell us a bit more about that.
Thank you very much for that question. So part of one of the findings of my work on agency and transformation has been the role of reflexivity in promoting change, and reflexivity at the individual level, but also reflexivity at the institutional level. Basically, I argue that without critical self-reflection, without reflecting on the ways in which we are privileged, the ways in which we are unprivileged by our positions within specific spaces or within specific contexts, then we cannot begin to see the problems within that space and the aspects within that space that need change. We're not able to recognize that if we experience the world or experience a particular context or institution in a particular way, then it means that, and that experience is influenced by our identities, our positionality, then it will be impossible for us to recognize and acknowledge that the possibility of other individuals experiencing that context differently. So the desire to change emerges from a recognition of our privilege and the ways in which we're not privileged, but also recognition of the ways in which others, in turn, might be privileged or not privileged by virtue of their positionalities and their identities. And outside that reflection, it is impossible to begin the work, at least internally, to think about change. So in my work on reflexivity, one of the things that first struck me was thinking about reflexivity in relation to research and particularly methods, data collection, and how we engage the analysis and interpretation process. And one of the problems there was that students would just say that I engaged in reflexivity as a response to questions about, say, trustworthiness, viability, and reliability, or the ethical concerns related to the project without necessarily actually engaging in reflexivity. And that kind of led me to the possibilities of individuals actually just saying that they've engaged in reflexive thinking, engaged in thinking about their the intersections of their identity and positional limitations and enablement, and what that means for change. So I talk about this kind of superficial, soft kind of reflexivity where individuals just say, I have reflected, but that reflection doesn't lead to action. And any kind of reflection, any kind of serious reflection or critical reflection must necessarily lead to action. The action doesn't need to be towards transformation. It can be towards reproduction or towards transformation. But any individual who is engaging in critical reflection of the identities and positionalities vis-a-vis the context, essentially is able to recognize problems with that context, recognize their power with that in that context, and use that power to either affect change or affect reproduction. The other thing I want to note in relation to reflexivity is that because this kind of reflexivity essentially entails us thinking through the ways in which we continue to be privileged and not privileged by our positionalities and our identities, it is a messy and difficult process. And regardless of where you are, where you stand, or who you are, I don't want to really go into binaries of oppression and privilege. But regardless of where you stand on the spectrum, it is going to be a difficult process of acknowledging the ways in which you are privileged by a context, by the power configurations in that context, by the structural conditions in that context, and the ways in which you are oppressed by that context it is a messy process. it is a discomforting process. And unless we are able to get through and walk through that messiness and discomfort, then we are not going to be able to come out on the other side to act either, like I said, towards reproduction or transformation. Add one more thing that this links to is the relationship between reflexivity and embodiment, highlighting that because of that the process of critical reflection and the messiness and the discomfort, it is an embodied process. It is a process that produces both internal and external challenges and responses in the individual.
All right. So I wanted to thank you for pointing to the messiness and discomfort. I think this is a really important aspect to explore and face when considering how to make long-lasting change in academia, as the emotional and individual response that we may encounter definitely plays an important role. As we go towards the conclusion of today's episode, I wanted to just, as a final question, ask if you can point to any resources or specific pointers that you would give those working in university management, administration, or human resources, or who work on gender equality plans, as they work to strengthen university policies in intersectional directions.
Also, the one thing that comes to mind, like in response to your question, is how the change process or transformation process needs to carry everyone along, be inclusive of everyone. It should not be left to either leaders or academics or students to drive, to push. Everyone needs to be an equal stakeholder in the transformation process. And in order for them to contribute effectively and enact their own agency, they need to first feel like they belong, and they need to feel like their contributions are wanted. So change cannot happen just from the top to the bottom, or from the bottom up. There needs to be a sense of like marrying of both the leaders and here to primarily of higher education context, of administrative staff, of faculty, and of students in contributing to change. Here, I would say the onus is on leaders to make those who the other stakeholders feel like their contributions are recognized, and their contributions are needed, and they feel like they belong, to enable them be interested and invested in participating and contributing to the transformation process.
Wonderful. Heartfelt thank you to Dr. Grace Ese-Osa Idahosa on behalf of the NEXUS Consortium, and a reminder to our listeners to follow the Euraccess Bulgaria YouTube channel for new episodes of the NEXUS podcast.